The Spencer carbine rifle gleamed dull in the afternoon sun as Silas Thorne leveled it at Ruth Halstead's chest. She clutched her newborn daughter against her torn cotton dress, the baby's cries piercing the dusty silence that had settled over the ramshackle mining camp of Crow's Landing. Blood and birthing fluid still stained Ruth's skirts from the labor that had consumed her through the previous night, and her 20-year-old face was drawn with exhaustion and fear. "Get out." Thorne commanded, his weathered features twisted with contempt. The mine boss stood tall and imposing in his black wool coat despite the Dakota Territory heat of July 1879. "Take your useless spawn and clear off my property." Ruth's stepchildren, 10-year-old Nell with her tangled brown braids and 8-year-old Peter clutching a wooden horse his father had carved, pressed themselves against the doorframe of what had been their home just 1 month ago before the mine collapse took their father. Their eyes were wide with terror as they watched the man who now claimed ownership of everything their family had built. "This is my home," Ruth whispered, her voice hoarse from the birthing ordeal. "Emmett married me proper. These are his children, and this—" She looked down at the red-faced infant in her arms. "This is Grace, his daughter." Thorne's laugh was harsh as prairie wind. "Daughter," he spat into the dust. "What use is a girl in mining country, can't swing a pick, can't work a shaft, can't earn her keep? Just another mouth that'll drain resources until some fool marries her off." His pale eyes narrowed. "And you ain't nothing but a temporary arrangement. Emmett's real family died years back. You got no legal standing here." The gathered townspeople, miners, shopkeepers, and their wives watched from a safe distance, their faces showing the cruel indifference of people who had learned to survive by not interfering with Silas Thorne's decisions. He controlled the Red Knife Mine, which meant he controlled their livelihoods, their food, their futures. A woman with a baby girl meant nothing against such power. Ruth struggled to stand straighter, fighting the weakness that still gripped her body. "Emmett left papers." "Papers." Thorne's voice cracked like a whip. "Show me these papers." When Ruth couldn't produce anything beyond May Wren's hastily scrawled birth record, his smile turned predatory. "Thought so. You got nothing, woman. Nothing but a burden that'll slow you down and cost money you ain't got." The baby's crying grew more insistent, and Ruth fumbled to adjust the ragged blanket that was all she had to protect Grace from the elements. The July heat was brutal, but nights on the Dakota plains could turn bitter cold without warning. "Please," Ruth said, hating how weak her voice sounded. "At least let the children stay. Nell can work. Peter's almost old enough. The boy might have value in a few years." Thorne conceded, his rifle still trained on her. "The girl," he glanced dismissively at Nell. "Maybe. But I ain't running a charity house, and I sure ain't feeding a baby that'll never earn back what she costs." That was when the shadow fell across the threshold. "You're coming with me." The voice was deep-accented with the cadence of someone who had learned English as a second language. Every person in the doorway turned to see a Lakota warrior standing motionless in the street, his presence as sudden and shocking as summer lightning. Tokala stood just over 6 feet tall, his shoulders broad beneath buckskin that had been decorated with blue and white beadwork. His black hair hung in 2 braids, wrapped with strips of red cloth, and 3 eagle feathers marked his war honors in the traditional headdress he wore. But it was the scars that drew the eye, a puckered line across his left temple, where a cavalry saber had nearly taken his life 2 summers past, and burn marks on his forearms from a prairie fire he had fought to save a trading post. His dark eyes were fixed on Ruth, and when he spoke again, his words carried absolute certainty. "You and the children. Come now." Silas Thorne's rifle swung toward this new threat, and the sound of the hammer being cocked was loud in the sudden quiet. "Get back to your reservation, savage. This ain't your concern." "Emmett Halstead traded fair with my people," Tokala replied, not moving from where he stood. He pulled me from a flash flood when my horse broke its leg in Thunder Creek. Said once that good folks should help each other regardless of what they looked like. Said he'd prepared safe places where important things could be hidden if darkness came to this land. He paused deliberately. I owe him a life debt. His family is under my protection. The mention of Emmett's cryptic reference to safe places passed over most listeners without recognition. But Ruth felt a strange flicker of memory. Her husband had indeed mentioned something about preparing for troubles about locations where valuable things could be kept secure if the worst happened. She had assumed he meant bank vaults or arrangements with trusted friends in larger towns. That debt died with him. Thorne snarled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Killing a white woman was one thing. She could be painted as a desperate vagrant who had threatened him. But killing a Lakota warrior, especially one with obvious standing in his tribe, could bring the kind of retaliation that would shut down mining operations for months. No, said another voice, calm and weathered with age. Among our people, debts to the dead become obligations to the living. Wicasa stepped into view from behind Ruth, moving with the careful dignity of a man in his 50s who had seen too many battles. Tokala's uncle wore simpler clothes, deerskin leggings and a cotton shirt obtained in trade, but the eagle-bone whistle around his neck and the sacred red paint on his cheekbones marked him as a man of spiritual authority among his people. Now Thorne faced two armed Indians in the middle of his town, with witnesses who would remember what happened next. The mine boss was cruel and greedy, but he wasn't foolish. He had built his power through calculated intimidation, not reckless violence, that would bring territorial marshals or cavalry investigations. You got no right, he began. The first stone came from somewhere in the crowd, a chunk of quartz that struck Wicasa's shoulder. Then another aimed at Tokala, who caught it bare-handed without flinching. The gathered townspeople, taking courage from each other's presence, began hurling rocks and shouting obscenities. Savages, get out of our town. Take your squaw and go back where you belong. Thorne's smile returned as he realized the crowd was doing his work for him. He wouldn't have to shoot anyone. The mob would drive the Indians off, probably kill them, and Ruth would be left defenseless with her baby. That was when Peter broke from the doorway. The 8-year-old boy ran straight toward Tokala, his carved wooden horse clutched in his small fist. Don't let them take Nell, he shouted. Please don't let them take us to the orphanage. A stone meant for Tokala struck Peter instead, opening a gash above his left ear. The child stumbled, but kept running until he reached the warrior's side. Blood streamed down his face as he looked up with fierce trust at a man he barely knew. The sight of an injured child changed something in the crowd's mood, but it also pushed Thorne past patience. His rifle cracked, sending a bullet high over Tokala's head, a warning shot that could become lethal at any moment. Tokala moved with the fluid speed of a man who had survived countless raids and skirmishes. In one motion, he scooped Peter up with his left arm while drawing the shortened double-barrel shotgun from beneath his buckskin shirt. The weapon had been modified for close fighting, the barrel cut down to 18 inches, the stock shortened and wrapped with rawhide for better grip. Ruth, he called sharply, take the baby and run to the stable, now. She didn't hesitate. Something in his voice, the same tone Emmett had used when warning her about unstable mine shafts, told her this was not the time for questions. Clutching Grace tightly against her chest, she stumbled toward the street. Wicasa had drawn his own weapon, a .44 caliber revolver, its grip worn smooth with use, and was backing toward the alley that led to the livery stable. Nell, he commanded. Come to me, child. The 10-year-old girl obeyed, darting between the adults with the quick reflexes of someone who had learned to dodge falling rocks in the mine tunnels where her father had worked. Wicasa caught her hand and pulled her toward safety. Thorne's rifle cracked again, this time in earnest. The bullet chipped mortar from the door frame where Ruth's head had been moments before. Tokala's shotgun answered, both barrels firing simultaneously with a sound like thunder. The double load of buckshot didn't hit Thorn. Takala had aimed high, deliberately not wanting to start a war, but it scattered the crowd and sent them diving for cover. Horses. Wakasa shouted over the screaming and confusion. He had reached the stable and was already pulling two rangy roans from their stalls. These weren't the fine cavalry mounts that officers rode, but tough plains horses bred for endurance and steady nerves. More rifles began firing from windows and doorways as Thorn's men joined the fight. Bullets whined through the air, striking wooden buildings with sharp cracks. Ruth ran bent over, trying to protect Grace with her body, while Nell kept pace beside her, and Peter clung to Takala's neck. They reached the horses as splinters flew from a post where someone's bullet had gone wide. Wakasa boosted Ruth and Grace onto the first roan, a steady mare, with the scars of old wire cuts on her legs. Takala lifted Peter onto the same horse before swinging up behind Ruth, his strong arms circling her waist to hold both her and the baby secure. "Hold tight," he told her, his breath warm against her ear. "This will be hard riding." Nell scrambled up behind Wakasa on the second horse, a gelding with one white sock and intelligent eyes. The old warrior turned both animals toward the back of the stable, where a gap in the fence led directly onto the open prairie. Behind them, Crow's Landing erupted in chaos as Thorn bellowed orders and men ran for their own mounts. The mine boss's voice carried clearly over the noise. $20 to whoever brings me the squaw and her brat dead or alive." The horses lunged through the fence gap and onto the grassland beyond, their hooves drumming against earth that was baked hard by the summer heat. Ruth had never ridden at such speed, and the jolting motion threatened to tear Grace from her arms. But Tokala's grip was sure, his body absorbing the worst of the impact as they raced away from the town. As they rode across the endless Dakota prairie, Tokala explained their situation over the wind of their passage. He had known Emmett through fair trades of tools and furs, and after Emmett's death in the mine collapse 1 month ago, Thorn had illegally seized the Red Knife mine claim and the family house. The mine boss considered Ruth a temporary bride, with no legal standing, and saw the newborn girl as worthless, unable to work the mines or defend the family's interests. "Your husband spoke of preparing for dark times," Takala called back to her. "Said he'd made arrangements, hidden things away where they could be found if his family needed protection. Do you know what he meant?" Ruth shook her head, then realized he couldn't see the gesture. "He mentioned having friends who understood surveys and maps. Said important papers should never be kept in just one place. But I never understood what he was preparing for, the evil that killed him." Wakasa said solemnly, his voice carrying over the hoofbeats. "Some men consume everything in their path like prairie fire. Emmett saw this coming. They crossed the shallow Cheyenne River at dusk, where Tokala wrapped Grace in his warm buffalo robe to protect her from the evening chill. The baby had quieted during the ride, lulled by the steady motion and the warmth of the bodies surrounding her. Ruth felt her strength flagging from the physical demands of childbirth and hard riding. But maternal instinct kept her focused on Grace's welfare above her own discomfort. They made camp in a grove of cottonwood trees, where Wakasa boiled willow bark into healing tea to reduce Ruth's fever and ease her recovery. For 2 days they rested while Ruth regained enough strength for continued travel. During this time, she learned more about the complex situation surrounding her family's legal standing. In the white world, papers mean everything. Tokala explained during one of their evening conversations. But Thorn controls the local courts, has bought judges and sheriffs with mining money. Your husband understood this. That's why he prepared other ways to protect his family. Tell me about Emmett saving your life," Ruth asked, wanting to understand the bond that had brought this fierce warrior to her aid. Takala's scarred face softened with memory. 2 winters passed. I was caught in a blizzard near Thunder Creek. My horse broke through ice, went down with a snapped leg. I was dying when your husband found me, carried me to his cabin, shared his food and fire for 3 days until the storm passed. When I thanked him, he said something I never forgot. The earth provides for all of us, red and white alike. When we remember that maybe our children can grow up as neighbors instead of enemies. Ruth felt tears sting her eyes at this glimpse of Emmett's character. Her husband had indeed believed in building bridges between communities, in finding common ground despite racial and cultural differences. It explained his cryptic references to preparations and safe places. He had been working to create networks of trust that could protect his family regardless of which side of the conflict held power at any given moment. On the third morning, a traitor brought devastating news that struck like a physical blow. Thorne was sending Nell and Peter to a Methodist orphanage in Nebraska Territory that very day. The wagon had already left Crow's Landing, guarded by armed men who would ensure the children reached their destination regardless of any rescue attempts. Ruth felt her world crumble at this revelation. Losing Nell and Peter to an institutional system would be as final as death. Children sent to such places rarely maintained contact with their families, and often emerged years later with their identities and connections completely severed. The thought of Grace growing up without knowing her half-siblings was unbearable. We have to stop them, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I can't let them disappear. Emmett would never forgive me, and I'd never forgive myself. But Tokala had been studying the situation with a warrior's tactical mind. Direct attack on an armed wagon would mean death for all of us, he pointed out. But if we can prove their removal is illegal, bring federal authorities into the matter. How long would that take? Ruth demanded. Days, maybe weeks. By then the children would be lost in the territorial system. Ruth made her decision with the clarity that comes from absolute desperation. Then we don't attack the wagon. We prove it should never have left in the first place. Emmett mentioned Archie Dawkins, the railroad surveyor who worked with him on territorial maps. If anyone has the legal papers that establish the children's rights, it would be him. It was a plan that required them to reach Fort Pierre while avoiding capture, locate Dawkins, and convince federal authorities to act on their evidence, all while caring for a newborn baby and staying ahead of professional bounty hunters. The odds were terrible, but the alternative was unthinkable. The journey to Fort Pierre took them across increasingly dangerous territory. Thorne's influence had spread word of the bounty throughout the region, turning every desperate man into a potential threat. They traveled by night when possible, hiding during daylight hours in whatever shelter they could find. Grace endured the hardships with remarkable resilience. But Ruth could see the strain showing in her daughter's increasingly frequent crying and restless sleep. Their first major confrontation came at Rapid Creek, where the summer drought had reduced the water to a muddy trickle between steep banks. As they approached the crossing at dawn, Wikasa's sharp ears detected the sound of horses moving upstream. Thorne's men had anticipated their route and positioned themselves for an ambush. 4 riders. Wikasa whispered, studying the terrain with experienced eyes. Well positioned on high ground, waiting for us to enter the water where we'll be vulnerable. The tactical situation was poor open ground on both sides of the creek, with enemies positioned to command the crossing. But remaining where they were meant eventual discovery by other search parties, while retreating would cost them precious time they couldn't afford. We go through. Ruth decided, settling Grace more securely in her arms. The decision surprised both warriors, but they could see the steel in her eyes that had been forged by necessity and maternal desperation. Fast and hard before they can coordinate their fire. Tokala nodded approvingly. The young woman was learning to think like a warrior, calculating risks and making decisions based on necessity rather than fear. Stay low on the horse, he advised. If shooting starts, protect Grace and let the mare find her own footing through the water. They broke cover at full gallop, the horses' hooves throwing up clouds of dust that partially concealed their approach. The ambush was sprung perfectly. Rifle fire erupted from both sides of the creek, bullets whining through the air around the fleeing riders. But Thorne's men had made one crucial error. They had positioned themselves too far from the water to guarantee accurate shots at moving targets. Wikasa's horse screamed as a bullet creased its shoulder, but the tough plains animal kept running despite the wound. Tokala's mare splashed into the creek, with bullets striking the water around her legs, sending up geysers that soaked her riders. Ruth held Grace against her chest, feeling the baby's small body pressed between herself and Tokala's protecting arm, as more shots cracked overhead. The crossing took perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. Ruth could hear men shouting on both sides as they reloaded their weapons and tried to track the moving targets through their gun smoke. One bullet came close enough to tear a hole in Ruth's skirt, and another shattered a tree branch just inches from her head. They reached the north bank as the firing began to slacken. The ambushers, having exhausted their prepared shots without achieving kills. But Ruth knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The men would mount up and resume pursuit within minutes, and their next encounter might not end as favorably. The horses won't maintain this pace much longer. Wikasa observed his own mount, showing signs of distress from the shoulder wound and hard running. Blood was beginning to streak the animal's front leg, and its breathing had become labored. "Wait, Fort Pierre is still 20 miles. Tokala replied, studying the horizon for signs of other threats. "We need to find fresh mounts or a place to make a stand where the odds aren't completely against us." That opportunity came sooner than expected in the form of May Wren's trading post, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods beside a bend in the Missouri River. The midwife who had delivered Grace emerged from her log cabin with a rifle in her hands and a determined expression on her weathered face. "Ruth Halstead," she called out. "Get those children inside quick now." May's post was built like a small fort with thick log walls and rifle ports that could be defended by a few people against larger numbers. As they dismounted and hurried inside, Ruth felt the first real sense of security she had experienced since Grace's birth. The cabin was cool and dim, filled with the comforting smells of herbs and cooking food. "Thorne's men came through yesterday," May explained as she examined Wikasa's wounded shoulder with practiced hands. "Asked about the birth records I filed for little Grace, wanted to know what papers I'd given you. Told them nothing, but they'll be back with more men and less patience." While May tended Wikasa's injury with bear grease and clean bandages, Ruth fed Grace and tried to process everything that had happened since their escape from Crow's Landing. The baby was thriving, despite the difficult circumstances, but Ruth could feel her own strength gradually returning as proper rest and nutrition began to heal her body from the trauma of childbirth. She said during a quiet moment, "Did Emmett ever mention hiding important papers, something about preparation for troubles, places where things could be kept safe?" May's weathered face grew thoughtful. "He did, actually. Came by about 2 weeks before the mine accident, seemed worried about something. Asked me to keep a copy of Grace's birth record separate from the official filing, said there might come a time when proving her existence would be important. Also mentioned having arrangements with that surveyor fellow Dawkins for maps and such." Before Ruth could pursue this line of questioning further, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of their pursuers. Through the trading post's small windows, they could see at least 6 riders surrounding the building and their weapons ready, and their faces showing the hard determination of men motivated by substantial bounty money. "Come out peaceful and nobody gets hurt." The voice belonged to Deke Morrison, a tracker known throughout the territory for his skill at hunting both animals and humans. "We just want the woman and the baby. Rest of you can ride away free." May Wren's response was to fire a warning shot through her front window, the bullet striking the ground near Morrison's horse and causing the animal to rear nervously. "This is private property," she shouted back. "You got no legal right to be here. We got territorial authority." Morrison replied, though Ruth doubted the truth of that claim. Signed warrant for the woman's arrest. She's wanted for theft and kidnapping. The siege that followed lasted until evening, with Morrison's men maintaining positions around the trading post, while occasionally firing shots to test the defenders' resolve. But May's building was too well constructed to be taken by simple assault, and the attackers seemed reluctant to risk the casualties that a direct attack would entail. As darkness fell, Dakota prepared to make his move. "In my people's way," he told Ruth quietly. "A warrior's greatest weapon is patience combined with knowledge of the land. These men think like soldiers. They watch the building but ignore the earth itself." Using skills learned during years of warfare against the cavalry, he slipped out of the trading post through a root cellar exit May had prepared for exactly such emergencies. His target was Morrison's horse herd, picketed in a shallow ravine behind the main siege positions. The Lakota warrior moved through the darkness like smoke, invisible to the white men who were focused on watching the building rather than protecting their mounts. Within an hour, he had cut loose all but 2 of their horses and scattered them across the prairie, leaving Morrison's men effectively stranded until they could recapture their animals. "Time to go," he announced upon returning to the trading post, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a successful mission. "They'll be busy for hours trying to round up their horses, and we can reach Fort Pierre before they organize effective pursuit." The escape was accomplished with May's help, who provided fresh horses and supplies for the final push to their destination. As they rode through the pre-dawn darkness, Ruth reflected on the chain of allies who had risked their own safety to help her family. May Tokala Wikasa, all of them choosing to do what was right despite the personal costs involved. Fort Pierre proved to be both salvation and revelation. Archie Dawkins was indeed in his office when they arrived, and the leather portfolio he withdrew from his safe contained documents that exceeded Ruth's most optimistic expectations. Emmett's detailed will named Ruth as guardian of all his children and designated them as equal heirs to his mining claims, regardless of gender. There were also survey maps showing mineral deposits that extended far beyond the areas Thorne had been working, and a letter addressed to federal authorities detailing suspicious circumstances surrounding several recent mining accidents in the district. "Your husband was more thorough than I realized," Dawkins admitted as they examined the documents by lamplight. "He documented everything: property boundaries or assays, even evidence of safety violations that caused injuries and deaths in Thorne's operations. This could bring down not just Thorne, but corrupt officials throughout the territorial mining establishment. But their moment of triumph was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar and unwelcome figure. Sonny Tokala's younger brother entered the office with 2 men wearing territorial deputy badges, their presence transforming the room from sanctuary into trap. "I'm sorry it has to be this way, brother," Sonny said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine regret. "But Thorne pays in silver dollars, not in honor and tradition. A man has to think about surviving in the world, as it is not as we wish it to be." The betrayal hit Tokala like a physical blow, and Ruth saw something fundamental break in his eyes as he processed his brother's treachery. In Lakota culture, family loyalty was sacred above all other considerations, and Sonny's choice to value money over kinship represented a violation of everything their people held dear. "You sold your own blood for white man's silver," Wikasa said quietly, his weathered face showing profound sadness rather than anger. "Sold children who never harmed you, a baby, who carries the innocence of new life." "I sold our future," Sonny replied defensively, but his eyes couldn't meet his uncle's gaze. "The old ways are dying. The buffalo are gone, the cavalry controls our movements, and the only choice is to adapt or starve on the reservation. Thorne offered me a partnership that would provide security in the white world." The philosophical argument might have continued, but the immediate tactical situation demanded action. The territorial deputies were positioning themselves to prevent escape, while Sonny covered them with a Winchester rifle that looked new and expensive, presumably purchased with Thorne's money. Ruth realized that all their careful planning and sacrifice would be meaningless if they were captured now, so close to presenting their evidence to federal authorities. Grace would grow up in an orphanage, never knowing her family's story or her father's legacy of honest work and community building. That was when Archie Dawkins surprised everyone by producing a telegraph message that had been delivered just hours earlier. Federal marshals are already en route from Deadwood. He announced calmly his surveyor's training, allowing him to remain collected under pressure. Should arrive tomorrow morning with authority to investigate territorial mining fraud. Seems someone has been sending them detailed information about corruption in local courts. The news transformed the dynamics of Confrontation. Sani and the territorial deputies had expected to arrest fugitives and return them to Thorne's custody for private justice. Instead, they found themselves facing federal investigation that would scrutinize every aspect of their actions and motivations. Doesn't matter, Sani said, but his voice lacked conviction. Thorne has arrangements with federal people too. Money talks in every language. Does it? Ruth challenged, rising from her chair with Grace in her arms and the legal documents clearly visible in her free hand. Because these papers don't just prove our inheritance rights. They document a conspiracy involving murder claim jumping and systematic theft from multiple properties throughout the territory. When federal investigators examined this evidence, she let the implications hang in the air, watching Sani's face as he began to understand the true scope of what they had discovered. This wasn't just about one family's mining claim. It was about a criminal enterprise that had been stealing from miners throughout the territory while bribing officials to cover up the fraud. The standoff continued through the night with both sides waiting for the arrival of federal authority that would determine their ultimate fates. Ruth spent the hours nursing Grace and reviewing Emmett's documents, marveling at her husband's foresight in preparing evidence that would protect his family even after his death. When Marshal Crawford arrived at dawn with a squad of federal deputies, the territorial officials melted away like snow in spring rain. Sani tried to present himself as a helpful scout who had been assisting in the apprehension of dangerous fugitives. But his story collapsed under the weight of evidence that Dawkins and Ruth presented. Mrs. Halstead, the marshal said after reviewing their documentation. You and your family are under federal protection now. These documents provide clear evidence of fraud and conspiracy that falls under federal jurisdiction. But I have to warn you, presenting this evidence publicly will make you targets for every corrupt official and criminal operator in the territory. We've been targets since the day Grace was born, Ruth replied firmly. At least now we have the law on our side. The journey to Deadwood took 3 days with the federal marshal's escort, ensuring safe passage through territory that had become a hunting ground for bounty seekers. Ruth used the time to prepare her testimony, organizing the evidence into a coherent narrative that would be compelling to territorial courts and federal investigators. But she also used the time to watch Grace develop and grow stronger with each passing day. The baby was becoming more alert and responsive, her dark eyes focusing on faces and sounds with increasing recognition. Ruth realized that despite the violence and upheaval surrounding her birth, Grace was thriving under the constant attention and protection that had been lavished on her. The confrontation at the Deadwood courthouse began with deceptive calm that should have warned Ruth of the dangers ahead. Judge Harrison Whitmore, the chief territorial magistrate, greeted them on the courthouse steps with polished courtesy that seemed genuine to casual observers. Mrs. Halstead, he said with practiced warmth. What a terrible ordeal you've endured. I understand you have some serious allegations to make regarding mining operations in Crow's Landing. Perhaps we should discuss these matters privately in my chambers, where we can examine your evidence without the distraction of curious onlookers. But Ruth's frontier-honed instincts warned her that the judge's smooth manner concealed hostile intentions. There was something in his pale eyes that reminded her too much of Silas Thorne, the calculating attention of a predator evaluating potential prey. "I prefer to make my statement in open court," she replied firmly, instinctively stepping closer to Tokala's protective presence. With official stenographers present to record everything for territorial records. Judge Whitmore's smile never wavered, but Ruth caught the brief flash of annoyance that crossed his features, a tell that revealed his true intentions. "I'm afraid that's not possible today. The regular court session doesn't convene until next week, and we have no stenographers available at present. But I assure you, any statement you make in my chambers will be given full consideration. Then we'll wait for the regular session." Ruth decided, her confidence growing as she sensed the judge's discomfort with her refusal to cooperate. "My children and I have waited this long for justice. We can wait a few more days if it means proper legal procedure." That was when Silas Thorne emerged from the courthouse entrance. The mine boss appeared with the casual confidence of a man who owned the building, and everyone in it, his expensive clothing and groomed appearance, suggesting a successful businessman, rather than the ruthless criminal Ruth knew him to be. But his eyes held the same cold calculation she remembered from their confrontation in Crow's Landing, and his presence at the territorial courthouse could only mean that corruption extended to the highest levels of government. "Mrs. Halstead," Thorne said with practiced concern, approaching with his hands visible and his manner suggesting friendly worry. "I'm so relieved to see that you and the children are safe. When I heard about the tragic misunderstanding at the mining compound—" "Misunderstanding?" Ruth's voice carried clearly across the courthouse steps, drawing the attention of bystanders who sensed they were witnessing something more significant than routine legal business. "You tried to murder my family." "Nothing of the sort," Thorne replied smoothly, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a patient adult dealing with an hysterical child. "My men were simply protecting company property from what appeared to be theft and vandalism. If they used excessive force during a regrettable situation, I sincerely apologize. But surely we can resolve these issues without burdening federal courts with what is essentially a business dispute between private parties." Ruth saw through his manipulation immediately. Thorne was positioning himself as a reasonable businessman dealing with an emotional and possibly unstable woman, while portraying her as the aggressor in a situation where she had actually been the victim. His smooth words were designed to sway the crowd of onlookers, turning public opinion against her before she could present her evidence. But she had learned something about fighting during her weeks of survival in hostile territory. Sometimes the best defense was a direct attack that exposed your enemy's true nature. "Show them the documents, Ruth," Nell said suddenly, her young voice cutting through the adult conversation with startling clarity. The 10-year-old had remained quiet during most of their journey, but now her natural protectiveness toward her baby sister overrode her learned caution around dangerous men. Ruth held up the leather portfolio containing Emmett's will, the survey maps, and the detailed evidence of mining fraud that her husband had carefully documented. The papers rustled in the morning breeze, but their existence was visible to everyone present on the courthouse steps. "I have legal proof that you murdered my husband," she announced loudly enough for all the bystanders to hear her voice gaining strength with each word. "I have his will naming me as guardian of all his children and establishing their equal inheritance rights, regardless of gender. I have survey maps showing the true extent of mining claims throughout this district, and I have evidence that you've been systematically stealing ore from multiple properties while bribing officials to cover up your crimes." The words hit Thorne like physical blows, and Ruth saw his mask of reasonable concern slip for just a moment, revealing the cold fury beneath. But he recovered quickly, gesturing toward Judge Whitmore with practiced deference. "Mrs. Halstead is obviously distressed by recent events," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that men used when they wanted to dismiss women's concerns as hysteria. "The poor woman has clearly been through a terrible ordeal, and I'm afraid the strain has affected her judgment." Perhaps she should be taken somewhere quiet where she can rest and recover her composure while we examine these alleged documents for authenticity. An excellent suggestion. Judge Whitmore agreed immediately, motioning toward two men who had been standing nearby with the casual alertness of professional guards. These gentlemen can escort Mrs. Halstead and the children to suitable accommodations while we conduct a proper legal examination of her claims. Ruth realized with crystalline clarity that she was being maneuvered into a sophisticated trap designed to neutralize her testimony before it could reach honest federal officials. Thorne and Judge Whitmore were working together to have her declared mentally incompetent or simply make her disappear into the territorial bureaucracy where corruption could operate without scrutiny. No, she said firmly, stepping back and positioning herself between the approaching guards and her children. We're not going anywhere with your people. And if you try to force us, everyone here will witness how territorial justice really works in Dakota. That was when Marshal Crawford stepped forward from where he had been observing the confrontation with growing interest. The federal lawman's weathered face showed the skepticism of someone who had seen corruption in many forms, and his hand rested casually on his service revolver. "Is there a problem here?" he asked mildly, his question directed at Ruth, but his eyes fixed on Judge Whitmore and the approaching guards. "These men are trying to suppress evidence of federal crimes." Ruth replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "They want to remove me and my children before we can present testimony about murder and mining fraud to proper federal authorities." "Interesting," Marshal Crawford said, his tone suggesting professional fascination rather than surprise. "Because I've been investigating reports of corruption in territorial mining districts, and Mrs. Halstead's allegations fit a pattern we've been tracking for months." The announcement transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Suddenly, Judge Whitmore and Silas Thorne found themselves facing federal investigation rather than conducting a simple suppression of inconvenient testimony. The courthouse steps filled with tension, as both sides recognized that the stakes had escalated beyond local politics into federal law enforcement. "By Marshal," Thorne said carefully, his businessman's instincts warning him to proceed with caution, "I'm sure we can clear up any misunderstanding about my business practices. Mrs. Halstead has been through a traumatic experience, and I'm afraid her accusations are the result of grief and confusion rather than actual evidence." "Nor, then you won't mind if we examine that evidence in a proper federal court," Marshal Crawford replied. "With stenographers, witnesses, and all the legal protections that Mrs. Halstead is entitled to under territorial law." It was the moment Ruth had been fighting toward since Grace's birth, and the chance to present Emmett's carefully gathered evidence to officials who couldn't be bought or intimidated by mining money. But even as hope surged in her chest, she could see Thorne's pale eyes calculating new strategies, measuring the odds of success through violence rather than legal manipulation. The mine boss's decision came with shocking suddenness. Instead of accepting legal defeat, he chose the desperate gamble of armed confrontation in broad daylight on the courthouse steps. His hand moved toward the revolver concealed beneath his coat, and Ruth realized that he intended to kill her and Grace rather than allow them to testify about his crimes. But Thorne wasn't the only one who had prepared for violence. His men had been positioned throughout the crowd of courthouse observers waiting for his signal to act. When he revealed his weapon, they followed suit drawing guns and opening fire on anyone who might support Ruth's testimony. The courthouse steps erupted into chaos as muzzle flashes exploded from multiple directions simultaneously. Marshal Crawford drew his service revolver and began returning fire while shouting orders to federal deputies positioned throughout the area. Tokala moved with deadly precision, his shortened shotgun speaking twice in rapid succession as he engaged the nearest threats. But the federal officers were outnumbered and caught in a crossfire that threatened to overwhelm their defensive capabilities. Ruth found herself pressed against the courthouse wall, with Grace clutched protectively against her chest, while bullets chipped stone inches from her head and filled the air with deadly splinters. Behind the pillar, Dakota shouted over the gunfire, pointing toward a massive stone column that offered better protection than their current position. "Move when I cover you." Ruth ran the 10 yards to the pillar, while Dakota's rifle kept enemy heads down. Grace crying now from the noise and chaos, but apparently uninjured by the flying debris. Nell and Peter followed close behind, their young faces showing terror, but also the grim determination of frontier children who understood that survival often depended on following adult instructions without question. The gunfight intensified as more of Thorne's men revealed themselves, some firing from courthouse windows, while others advanced across the street with rifles and revolvers blazing. Marshal Crawford's deputies were skilled professionals, but they were fighting uphill against superior numbers in an urban environment where civilian casualties were inevitable. Bullets whined through the air like angry wasps striking stone and wood, with sharp cracks that echoed across the courthouse square. Ruth could hear people screaming as they ran for cover, could smell the acrid smoke of black powder that filled the air with a haze that made accurate shooting difficult for both sides. "They're trying to flank us from the east," one of the deputies shouted, pointing toward a group of gunmen who were working their way around the courthouse building to establish a crossfire position. Marshal Crawford's tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. His men were skilled and disciplined, but they were facing an enemy that had prepared for this confrontation with superior numbers and strategic positioning. The federal lawmen needed to break the enemy's coordination before they could be surrounded and overwhelmed. That was when Silas Thorne made his personal decision to end the battle through direct action. Instead of directing the fight from a safe distance, the mine boss abandoned any pretense of respectability and joined the violence personally. He emerged from the courthouse entrance with a heavy Colt revolver in his hand, his expensive clothing disheveled, and his face twisted with the fury of a man watching 20 years of criminal enterprise collapse around him. "You've destroyed everything," he screamed over the gunfire, his voice cracking with rage and desperation as he advanced toward Ruth's position behind the stone pillar. 20 years of building planning working ruined by a woman and her bastard children. Ruth saw him coming and felt ice form in her veins. This wasn't random violence in the heat of battle. This was calculated murder driven by pure malice. Thorne had decided that if he couldn't suppress her testimony through legal manipulation, he would eliminate her and Grace through direct assassination. The distance closed with terrifying speed. 20 yards. 15. 10. Ruth could see Thorne's face clearly now, could see the hatred burning in his pale eyes as he prepared to commit murder in front of dozens of witnesses. His revolver was aimed directly at Grace, and Ruth realized with sick certainty that he intended to kill the baby first and then her eliminating the primary threats to his empire, even if it meant his own death in the resulting battle. Marshal Crawford was engaged with other targets and couldn't shift his fire in time. Dakota was behind different cover, reloading his weapon with hands that moved with desperate speed, but still seconds away from being ready. The federal deputies were fighting their own battles against superior numbers and couldn't provide assistance. Ruth tried to shield Grace with her own body, turning away from Thorne's approach and presenting herself as a target instead of the baby. But the mine boss was too experienced with violence to be fooled by such a simple maneuver. He adjusted his aim to follow Grace's movement, his finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow as Ruth watched death approaching her daughter. The courthouse steps, the shouting voices, the crack of rifles, everything faded into background noise as her world narrowed to the immediate threat facing Grace. She could see Thorne's knuckle whitening as he prepared to fire, could see the hatred in his eyes as he prepared to murder an innocent baby out of pure spite. 5 yards, 4-3. That was when 8-year-old Peter Halstead made the most important decision of his young life. The boy had been watching from his own position behind the stone pillar, his child's mind processing the adult violence around him with startling clarity. He could see the gun pointed at his baby sister. He could see the terror on his stepmother's face. He could see that none of the adults who were supposed to protect them would be able to act in time. In that moment of crystalline understanding, Peter made a choice that defined his character forever. He wasn't thinking about heroics or glory. He was thinking about grace, about the tiny sister who depended on the adults around her for protection, about the family that had already lost too much to Silas Thorne's greed. The 8-year-old boy launched himself from behind the stone pillar with every ounce of strength and determination his small body possessed. His target was Thorne's legs, the only part of the mind boss he could reach from his position near the ground. It wasn't a sophisticated battle plan. It was pure, desperate courage translated into action. Peter's small body crashed into Thorne's knees like a cannonball, his slight weight multiplied by the force of his running leap. The impact wasn't enough to bring the large man down completely, but it spoiled his aim and sent his shot wide, the bullet striking stone where Grace's head had been a split second earlier. The sound of the gunshot was deafeningly loud at close range, and Grace's cries intensified as the noise traumatized her developing hearing. But she was alive, unharmed, except for fear protected by her 8-year-old brother's willingness to sacrifice his own safety for hers. Thorne snarled with animal fury and backhanded Peter across the face with his free hand, and the blow sending the child sprawling across the courthouse steps with blood streaming from his nose. The boy's wooden horse, carved by his father's loving hands, went skittering across the stone, forgotten in the violence. But Peter's desperate gamble had achieved its purpose. The distraction gave Tokala the time he needed to complete his reload and take careful aim at the man who had murdered his friend and terrorized the family he had sworn to protect. The Lakota warrior's rifle spoke once the carefully aimed bullet, taking Silas Thorne through the heart and dropping him to the stone steps where he had tried to commit murder in broad daylight. The mine boss's revolver clattered away across the courthouse entrance, its threat ended forever by the precise marksmanship of a man who had learned to shoot during years of warfare against overwhelming odds. Thorne's death broke the coordination and morale of his remaining men. Some fled immediately, recognizing that their employer's defeat meant the end of their protection from federal prosecution. Others continued fighting, but without the focused leadership that might have given them victory against the disciplined federal deputies. The gunfight continued for several more minutes as Marshal Crawford's men systematically overwhelmed the remaining resistance. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. As the smoke cleared and the last shots echoed away across Deadwood's main street, Ruth found herself still alive, still clutching Grace, still surrounded by the family they had fought so desperately to protect. "It's over," Marshal Crawford announced, his service revolver still smoking in his hand as he surveyed the aftermath of the battle. "Silas Thorne is dead, and his criminal organization is finished. The corruption that protected his operations throughout Dakota territory ends here today." Ruth looked down at Grace, who had stopped crying and was looking up at her with the serene trust of a child who had never known anything but love and protection, despite the violence surrounding her birth. In that innocent gaze, Ruth saw the future she had been fighting to secure, one where children could grow up without fear, where families were protected by honest law rather than threatened by corruption. But her attention was immediately drawn to Peter, who was sitting on the courthouse steps with blood streaming from his nose and tears running down his dirt-stained cheeks. The 8-year-old boy who had saved his sister's life was crying not from pain, but from the emotional release of surviving a battle that no child should have witnessed, let alone participated in. Ruth knelt beside Peter and pulled him into a fierce embrace, careful not to jostle Grace, but desperate to comfort the brave little boy who had proven that courage had nothing to do with age or size. "You saved her," she whispered into his ear, her own tears mixing with his. "You saved Grace, and you saved all of us. I was so scared." Peter confessed, his small voice muffled against Ruth's shoulder. "But I couldn't let him hurt her. Papa always said family protects family no matter what. Your papa would be so proud of you." Ruth told him, her voice thick with emotion. So proud of both his children, you for your courage, and Nell for her wisdom in knowing when to speak the truth. The immediate crisis was over, but Ruth knew that the emotional healing would take much longer. Peter had been forced to act like an adult in a situation that would have challenged grown men, and Nell had witnessed violence that would give her nightmares for months to come. Grace was too young to remember the specific events, but the trauma of her first weeks of life might have lasting effects that wouldn't become apparent until she was older. Oh, what happens now? Dakota asked quietly, approaching with his rifle still ready, despite the apparent end of hostilities. The Lakota warrior's face showed the satisfaction of a mission completed, but also the weariness of a man who had seen too much death and violence in his lifetime. Now we rebuild. Marshal Crawford replied, holstering his weapon and beginning to organize the arrest of surviving members of Thorne's organization. The Red Knife Mine and all associated properties revert to their rightful owners, Mrs. Halstead and her children. The territorial government will provide support for transition to honest management, and there will be federal oversight to ensure that this kind of corruption never takes root again in any Dakota mining district. The words represented everything Ruth had been fighting for since Grace's birth, but she found it difficult to feel triumphant while surrounded by the evidence of violence and death. Too many people had died Emmett Wikesa, the various gunmen who had chosen money over morality, for this to feel like a clean victory. The children need time to heal, she said, settling Grace more securely in her arms while keeping one hand on Peter's shoulder. All of them. This kind of trauma. She gestured helplessly at the battlefield the courthouse steps had become. Time they'll have, Dakota assured her. The fighting is finished. Now comes the harder work of building something better from what remains. The journey home to Crow's Landing took a full week, traveling at a pace that accommodated Grace's needs and allowed the family to begin processing the trauma they had endured. They were no longer fugitives fleeing for their lives, but citizens under federal protection, returning to claim their rightful inheritance and begin the long process of rebuilding their community. The transformation of Crow's Landing began immediately upon their return. With Thorne's death and the exposure of the corruption that had protected his operations, honest miners and merchants began emerging from years of intimidated silence. The Red Knife Mine reopened under safety protocols that prioritized worker welfare alongside productivity, and the increased wages and improved conditions attracted skilled workers from across the territory. Ruth established herself in the administrative office that had once been Thorne's private domain, converting it into the operational center for what became known as the Halstead Mining Company. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now sitting behind the desk of the man who had tried to murder her daughter, making decisions that would benefit the entire community, rather than enrich a single criminal. Grace thrived in this environment of stability and security. The baby grew into a healthy, alert child, whose dark eyes and ready smile made her a favorite among the mining camp families. She spent her days in the company of children and adults who had learned to see her not as a burden or a threat, but as a symbol of hope for the future they were all working to build. Nell returned to school with enthusiasm that surprised her teachers, throwing herself into learning with the intensity of a child who had seen the importance of knowledge and education in fighting injustice. She also took on a protective role toward Grace that went beyond simple sisterly affection. Nell had been present during the worst of their ordeals, and she was determined that her baby sister would never face such dangers again. Peter's recovery proved more complex. The 8-year-old boy had been forced to make adult decisions under extreme pressure, and the psychological weight of that responsibility didn't disappear with the return of safety. He experienced nightmares about the courthouse battle, startled at sudden loud noises, and sometimes withdrew into himself when discussing the events that had shaped his young life. But Peter also showed remarkable resilience, channeling his experiences into a maturity and determination that impressed every adult who knew him. he began working alongside Dakota in the expanded operations of the mine, learning skills that combine traditional craftsmanship with the technical innovations needed for safe and efficient mineral extraction. The boy has the makings of a fine engineer, Archie Dawkins observed during one of his visits to review the mine's expansion plans. Give him proper schooling to go with his practical experience, and he could build projects that would make his father proud. 6 months after their return to Crow's Landing, Ruth stood in the doorway of the house that had been restored to her family's ownership and marveled at how completely their lives had changed. The autumn air carried the sense of productive work rather than fear and violence, and the sounds drifting through the evening were those of a thriving community rather than an oppressed mining camp. The new safety equipment is working better than we projected. Dakota reported entering the kitchen where Ruth was preparing dinner while Grace played contentedly in her wooden high chair. Accident rates are down to almost nothing, and worker morale has never been higher. The mine is producing more ore than it ever did under Thorne's management. These improvements represented more than just operational upgrades. They embodied Ruth's commitment to honoring Emmett's memory by creating the kind of mining operation he would have been proud to leave to his children. The initial investment in safety and worker welfare had been substantial, but it was already producing returns in both productivity and community stability. There's something else? Dakota continued, his tone becoming more serious as he settled into the chair across from Ruth's desk. We found something unusual while excavating the new shaft connection to the old Miller property. A hidden chamber that your husband apparently carved out and sealed before his death. Ruth's interest sharpened immediately. Emmett's cryptic references to safe places and preparations for dark times had always puzzled her, but she had assumed he meant arrangements with trusted friends or safety deposit boxes in distant towns. The possibility that he had created a physical hiding place on the mining property itself had never occurred to her. What kind of chamber? She asked, settling Grace on her hip as her curiosity overcame domestic routine. Come see for yourself. Dakota suggested, his scarred face showing an expression she had learned to recognize as suppressed amazement. But Ruth, what we found in there, it's going to change everything. Not just for us, but for the entire relationship between white settlers and the Lakota throughout Dakota Territory. The journey to the old Miller mine took 20 minutes on horseback, with Grace enjoying the ride in the specially designed carrier that Dakota had crafted to keep her secure during travel. Nell and Peter had already been to see the discovery and were waiting at the mine entrance with barely contained excitement, their young faces bright with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from being the first to witness something historically significant. The hidden chamber was accessed through a narrow passage that had been concealed behind deliberately placed rockfall, indicating that Emmett had taken extraordinary measures to protect whatever lay within. The excavation itself was entirely hand-carved from solid rock, representing months or even years of patient labor, by a man who understood that some secrets were worth any amount of effort to preserve. But it was the contents of the chamber that took Ruth's breath away and revealed the true scope of her husband's vision for the future. The walls were covered with sophisticated artwork that depicted scenes of cooperation and formal negotiation between Lakota bands and white miners, showing peaceful exchanges of goods and what appeared to be treaty ceremonies conducted around council fires. The paintings were clearly the work of someone with considerable artistic skill, but more importantly, they documented events that had never appeared in any official territorial records. Written documents were mounted carefully throughout the chamber treaties agreements and correspondence that told a completely different story of white Indian relations in the Dakota Territory than anything that appeared in government files or newspaper accounts. These weren't crude frontier scrawls, but formal legal documents executed with proper ceremony and witnessed by legitimate representatives of both peoples. But it was the letter mounted prominently on the chamber's main wall that revealed the full extent of Emmett's planning and foresight. Ruth approached the document and immediately recognized her husband's careful handwriting, though the content was unlike anything she had ever seen from him. My dearest Ruth, if you are reading this, then my fears about Silas Thorne have proven justified, and I am likely dead by his hand or arrangement. What you see in this chamber represents 4 years of careful work to establish legal foundations for peaceful coexistence between our mining community and the Lakota bands, who are the original inhabitants of this land. These are genuine treaties negotiated in good faith and signed by legitimate representatives of both peoples. They provide for shared mineral extraction with percentage payments to the affected tribes in exchange for peaceful access to traditional hunting grounds that happen to contain valuable ore deposits. The financial projections alone show that this cooperative approach would generate more wealth for everyone involved than the current system of conflict and forced removal. Thorne knows about these treaties and has been systematically suppressing them to avoid the profit sharing they require. He has bribed territorial officials to hide the documents and intimidated anyone who might testify about their existence. My death will likely be staged to look like an accident. But if you find this chamber, you will have everything needed to expose the entire conspiracy and establish a new model for development in Dakota territory. Use these documents not just to protect our children's inheritance, but to create the foundation for the kind of community I always envisioned, one where different peoples can work together for mutual benefit instead of destroying each other for individual gain. Grace will grow up in whatever world we create through our choices. Make those choices worthy of the love we share. All my devotion and all my hopes for your future, Emmett. The letter was dated just 10 days before Emmett's death, proving that he had anticipated his murder and taken extraordinary measures to preserve evidence that could bring his killers to justice, while also protecting the larger vision of cooperation that had motivated his secret diplomatic work. He planned all of this. Ruth whispered, her voice filled with awe and grief in equal measure, as the full scope of her husband's foresight became clear. The hidden chamber, the legal documents, the artistic record, even the arrangements for our survival and escape. He knew Thorne would kill him, but he made sure we would have everything needed to fight back and build something better. More than fight back. Dakota corrected, studying the treaty documents with growing amazement. These agreements could reshape territorial policy throughout the entire northern plains. They prove that peaceful cooperation is not only possible, but more profitable than the current system of conquest and exploitation. Ruth spent hours in the chamber reading document after document that revealed the scope of Emmett's secret diplomatic work. He had negotiated agreements with 7 different Lakota bands, establishing frameworks for shared mining operations that protected traditional hunting grounds, while providing steady income streams for tribal communities facing forced relocation to reservations. The financial projections were staggering. Properly implemented, the treaty arrangements would generate millions of dollars in combined revenue, while maintaining the environmental and cultural integrity that both peoples valued. It was a vision of development that served human needs rather than exploiting them, proving that alternatives to the violent conquest model were both possible and practical. What do we do with this information? Ruth asked as they prepared to leave the chamber. The magnitude of what they had discovered was almost overwhelming, reaching far beyond their personal concerns into questions of federal Indian policy and territorial development that could affect thousands of lives throughout the northern plains. We honor it. Dakota replied simply, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that had guided him through their entire ordeal. We use these documents to create the kind of community Emmett envisioned, one where different peoples work as partners rather than enemies. And we teach Grace to carry that vision forward into whatever world she inherits. The presentation of Emmett's treaties to federal authorities required 8 months of careful legal work, complicated by the need to authenticate documents that contradicted official territorial policy. But the results exceeded even Ruth's most optimistic hopes. The territorial government was forced to acknowledge the validity of the agreements, and several corrupt officials, including the late Judge Whitmore's associates, faced federal prosecution for suppressing legal documents and accepting bribes. More importantly, the treaties provided a legal foundation for establishing the first cooperative mining district in Dakota Territory, where white and Lakota families worked together as equal partners rather than adversaries. The Red Knife Mine became the flagship operation for this new model, producing wealth that benefited both communities while preserving the cultural traditions that gave meaning to economic success. Ruth had accepted the appointment to the Territorial Mining Commission, using her position to prevent fraud and promote the cooperative model throughout the region. Her work required extensive travel to investigate claims and mediate disputes, but she arranged her schedule to spend most of her time in Crow's Landing, where Grace could grow up, surrounded by the extended family that circumstances had created. On a clear October evening, as the first frost painted the prairie grass silver, and the mine operations wound down for the day, Ruth stood in her kitchen preparing dinner, while Grace played with wooden blocks in her high chair. The baby was now 10 months old, healthy and alert, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her, with curious intelligence, and a ready smile that had become a symbol of hope throughout the community. Through the window, she could see Nell teaching younger children to read in the community school that the mining cooperative had established, while Peter worked with Tokala in the expanded blacksmith shop, learning skills that combine traditional metalworking with the innovative techniques needed for modern mining equipment. The territorial governor wants to visit next month, Tokala announced, entering the kitchen with the easy familiarity of a man who had become an integral part of the household routine over the past year. He's heard about our cooperative model and wants to see if it can be replicated in other districts throughout Dakota Territory. Oh, good, Ruth replied, lifting Grace from her chair as the baby began fussing for attention and the evening feeding that had become their quiet time together. The more people who understand what's possible when communities work together instead of fighting each other, the better the future will be for all our children. She settled into the rocking chair that Tokala had made for her during the winter months, Grace nursing contentedly, while the evening light painted the room in shades of gold and amber. Outside, the sounds of a thriving community drifted through the open windows, children playing games that mixed white and Lakota traditions, adults discussing the day's work in both languages, and the distant rhythm of mining operations that provided prosperity without exploitation or environmental destruction. Do you ever regret it? Tokala asked quietly, settling into the chair across from her with the deliberate movements of a man whose body carried the accumulated injuries of a lifetime of warfare. Everything that happened, all the violence and danger we went through to get here. Ruth considered the question seriously, thinking about the price they had all paid for the security and justice they now enjoyed. Emmett was dead, his wisdom and guidance lost forever. Wikasa had died protecting them, his knowledge and spiritual authority gone from the world. Even Sani was serving a federal prison sentence for his role in the conspiracy, his family ties severed by choices that couldn't be undone. No, she said finally, her voice carrying quiet certainty born of hard experience and careful reflection. Emmett died to protect his vision of what this community could become. Wikasa gave his life to ensure that vision survived long enough for us to understand it. Even Sani, in his way, contributed to the final outcome by providing information that helped expose the full scope of the corruption. Grace had finished nursing and was looking up at Ruth with sleepy contentment, her small hand curled around her mother's finger with surprising strength. In that trusting grip, Ruth felt the weight of responsibility for all the choices that had brought them to this moment of peace and prosperity. Grace will grow up knowing her father was a man who believed in justice and cooperation rather than conquest and exploitation. She continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when thinking through complex problems. She'll know that sometimes good people have to fight to protect what matters most, but that the goal is always to build something better, not just to destroy what's wrong. Tokala nodded slowly, his own understanding shaped by years of warfare that had taught him the difference between fighting for survival and fighting for a future worth having. "The old ways are changing for all our peoples," he observed. "But maybe some changes can be for the better if we're wise enough to learn from each other instead of just trying to dominate or be dominated." Through the window, Ruth could see the lights beginning to come on in houses throughout Crow's Landing, each one representing a family that had found security and opportunity in the cooperative model that Emmett's vision had made possible. Children were being called in for supper. Men were washing the honest dirt of productive labor from their hands. Women were preparing meals with ingredients purchased using fair wages rather than company scrip that bound them to exploitative employers. It was not the world Ruth had been born into, a world of conflict and mutual suspicion between peoples who should have been natural allies. But it was the world she had chosen to create for Grace and all the children who would follow, a world where different cultures could find common ground in their shared humanity and mutual need for security, prosperity, and meaning. As darkness settled over the Dakota territory and the mining camp settled into its evening routine, Ruth rocked gently in her chair and sang the lullaby that Emmett had taught her during the early days of their marriage, a simple melody that spoke of love, protection, and hope for the future. Grace listened with drowsy attention, her dark eyes gradually closing as sleep overtook her small body. "Sleep well, little one," Ruth whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead, while breathing in the sweet scent that belonged uniquely to babies who had known nothing but love and security since the moment of their birth. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but tonight we are safe, we are together, and we are home." The story that had begun with violence and desperation had evolved into something far more significant, a testament to the power of ordinary people. To choose justice over expedience, cooperation over conflict, love over fear. Grace would grow up hearing this story, understanding that her very existence had been worth fighting for, and that the community around her had been built by people who believed that every child deserved protection and opportunity, regardless of gender, race, or the circumstances of their birth. Outside, the Dakota wind carried the sense of autumn across the prairie, promising the approach of winter, but also the renewal that would come with spring. Ruth closed her eyes and listened to the peaceful sounds of a community. At rest, sounds that spoke of security earned through struggle, prosperity achieved through cooperation, and hope maintained through the determined love of people who refused to accept that the world had to be a place where children grew up afraid. Grace slept peacefully in her arms, dreaming whatever dreams come to babies who have known nothing but love and protection since drawing their first breath. And in that perfect quiet, Ruth felt the deep satisfaction of a woman who had honored her promises, protected her family, and helped build something that would endure long after she was gone. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities that Emmett could only have imagined, but that his daughter would live to see fulfilled. It was a legacy worth any sacrifice, a victory worth any cost, a love story written not just in words, but in the lives of children who would grow up believing that the world could be better than the one they had inherited. The story was complete, but the life it had made possible was just beginning.